welcome to another amazing episode of Say It Online, where we help digital agency owners stop just randomly shouting into the void and start communicating meaningfully and effectively in this digital age. I'm your host, Say Gabriel, and this episode was brought to you by our sponsor, Anansi Content. If you're sick of conversion content being a huge pain in your agency's butt, especially websites, campaigns, etc., let's talk. With the smoothest content process ever, a team of unbelievably skilled and organized content strategists, and years of subcontracting experience, Anansi is looking to make your life as a digital agency owner unbelievably easier. Just head, if you're interested, to anansicontent.com, that's ANANSI content.com, and hit Let's Talk. And now, without further ado, here's our episode. All right, today we are welcoming Harris III. So while people around the globe know Harris III as an award-winning illusionist, in the last few years, his career has exploded into becoming a sought-out keynote speaker, storyteller, and event curator. His endeavors expanded as an entrepreneur as he founded the Istoria Collective, an event and production company that creates and executes meaningful and transformative experiences for people and brands through both live events and a variety of other mediums. His experience has taken him to thousands of stages in 49 states across America and almost 40 countries throughout Europe, Asia, Africa, and even the Middle East. Now that Harris is entering the next decade of his career, he is going at it with a new enthusiasm for stories and art. In 2016, he began a new season by relaunching the Story Conference, which is how I first connected and heard of him. But what began as a simple 2-day annual conference has exploded into a prolific movement of culture-shaping storytelling. We'll get into what that means. Story has had speakers from companies with Disney, DreamWorks, Pixar, Nike, YouTube, Nat Geo, and even NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratories. I'm curious as to the stories there, and more. Harris is awakening childlike wonder, imagination, and curiosity in a way that only someone who believes in real magic can. So my inner child is so delighted to talk to you, Harris. That was a lot of information. Why don't you share a little bit in your own words with us about, how you moved from being, an illusionist to building a whole conference and career around story and storytelling?
That is a great question. I think a lot of it came down to probably my epiphany when I realized that an illusionist or a magician is really just someone who tells stories. I think we have a tendency to take the different performing arts and put them in different genres. But I realized at one point that, every performing art, like dance, is the same as film or the written word on a page. They're all simply artistic mediums that we use to tell stories through. And so storyteller kind of became the thing that I realized we all are. And I was like, I'm not really an illusionist who tells stories. I'm a storyteller who happens to tell stories by doing magic tricks. And so I think that was the first epiphany where I really started coming to a full understanding of what storytelling really was.
I think that definition of story and that kind of lens through which to view the world in art is something that I not only relate to, but maybe even kind of get up on a soapbox about fairly frequently with my team. I'm not sure if all of our listeners know even what being an illusionist, what kind of magic tricks, can you dig into a little more, what literally that means and how you tell a story through that medium?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we are all telling stories, not to try to dodge your question, but narrative is basically the operating system of our brains. It's how we organize information. It's how we make sense in the world around us. So in one sense, we can't not tell stories. We can tell stories poorly. We can unintentionally tell stories. But even if you don't intentionally tell a story through your work or what you do or in a meeting or even the times that you communicate nonverbally without words, the person that you were communicating with is going to walk away telling themselves a story because it is their brain's only way to make sense of what it is they felt like you were trying to communicate. And so that means that someone standing on stage and doing a traditional illusion, like cutting a lady in half and putting her back together again, obviously they're not actually cutting someone in half. They're creating the illusion that they are. But that is a story, as a beginning, a middle, and end. It's a perfect example of a story in the context of magic and illusions. You're taking something that is totally normal, a person's body. You introduce conflict. Oh no, Her legs are over there and her head is over there. What's going to happen? There's tension, there's conflict. Will it be resolved? Yeah, with a little bit of magic and an illusionist snapping his fingers or waving a magic wand, whatever, presto, the lady's body is back together. And so whether it's you turn on a piece of music and put someone in a box and cut them in half, or you tell a story about how you got started in magic by telling your origin story of your interest in becoming an illusionist as a little kid. At the end of the day, the trick can change, but all of those tricks are all, again, it's just a medium through which that I tell stories through. And so I view myself as a storyteller who just happens to do fake things that look very real. And I also think that the medium is the message. And so we could get into that a little bit if you want to, but really that means that most of the stories that I try to tell, if I believe the medium is the message, are usually conversations around what's fake and what's real, or the thing that magic can gift you, which is that sense of wonder, that childlike wonder. Otherwise, everything else feels a little bit bait and switch and disconnected.
There was quite a few what I call gold nuggets in there. And I do actually want to dig into this whole the medium is the message idea. But I don't want to lose something that you said a little bit earlier on, which is that not just that we are all storytellers in the sense of, our art or our creativity or what we're doing in the world is telling a story, but that your brain is quite literally always telling you a story when you walk away. That is something that I think has been just an incredible, incredible thing for me to learn in my life on a personal level, personal growth level, as well as, on kind of a business, as well as an empathetic connection level. And what I'm hearing from you is that as creative, as a maker of magic, whether that is, as you said, doing these so-called fake things, or whether it is, creating something tangible, or whether it is even building a website, you get the opportunity to affect what that story is that people are walking away with. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't even say that we have the opportunity to. I would say that's happening, whether we choose to or not. Again, we are storytelling creatures. It's not one of the ways that we think. It's not one of the ways that our brain operates. It is the way. Think of it like a programming language. So if you think of your brain as a computer, which isn't a completely accurate analogy, but for the sake of analogy, like my Apple iPhone runs off of a programming language called iOS. It is the programming language that other software engineers can use to create apps to make sure everything functions properly. My parents own a computer that runs off of a language called Windows, and Windows is probably rooted in another language. I'm not a programmer, so I don't know what all those languages are. But every device runs off of a different language, and the operating system of our brains is quite literally story. So even something that may not seem like a story, like an Excel spreadsheet filled with nothing but numbers, the only way for your brain to make sense of those numbers is to apply value or meaning to them. And so we do that by figuring out what is the story that these numbers tell. So we literally can't even process information outside of the context of storytelling and narrative.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, Harris, because this has actually been something internally that we've been working on quite a bit. We have these sheets we look at weekly called scorecards, and there are numbers on them which tell us a story about how the business is doing. And for a long time, we kind of assumed that these numbers on their own told a story that everyone could understand. But what we came to realize is that they alone were kind of they did have the opportunity for a story to be told about them. They were telling a story, but not everybody could interpret it. And one of the major roles that we've identified for our chief of ops is actually to figure out which story is coming from those numbers and how to communicate the story or invite the people that she is talking to into that story in a way that actually helps them be more focused, create better goals, be more empowered, celebrate their wins. And I mean, all of this from, 4 to 6 numbers on a sheet that get updated every week. It's kind of crazy.
Sure. Yeah, this is very simple in concept, but it's very complex to perform accurately because we all look at the world subjectively. It's very hard to be objective and all see the world the same way. We don't do that. We view the world through our unique lens and all the stories of our past and the story that we tell ourselves about who we are, whether that story is true or not, which to me is why that's all connected back to my background. of my work as an illusionist, because what being an illusionist taught me is that everyone sees the world differently, and that we are willing to tell ourselves more stories that aren't true than we realize. Because if you see something on stage levitating, and you're seeing it with your own eyes and you're going, well, it was absolutely levitating because I saw it right in front of my face, it doesn't literally mean that that object was levitating. I created the illusion that it was, because I don't have the power to make something levitate, which means that your senses, your feelings, the story that I told around that illusion that made it more realistic, all of it led to you telling yourself a story that isn't true. And so we have a tendency to live our lives by, kind of what we see, smell, taste, touch, and hear, or trusting our feelings. But if all that's subjective, those senses, those feelings can always be fooled and manipulated. And so seeing isn't really believing as much as believing is seeing. So what we believe has the power to change what we see, and we often see what we want to see. So the story that we're telling ourselves informs that data, those numbers, which is why 6 different people might look at those numbers and walk away with 6 different stories, unless one person comes in and effectively identifies what the story is and does a great job as a storyteller telling that story to those other 5 people.
Agreed 100%. I think that's a brilliant and succinct way of framing it as well. I'm curious how this concept ties into what you were talking about the medium being the message. I confess, I'm not fully sure I understand what you mean by that. Do you mean that, no, actually, I'm not sure. Can you just explain?
Yeah, I mean, there seems to be, I find this a lot in, with people who make art from a particular agenda-driven motive where they're trying to influence what people believe through the art. Oftentimes it falls short of being art because the story they're telling isn't really a part of the medium. It's more of a bait and switch approach where I'm trying to use this provocative art to get your attention so that I can communicate something different. And so what I mean by that is, like in my circle, in the magic industry, there's a lot of illusionists and magicians who, in order to make a living, they might go to maybe a trade show, and you are in the, you're in the insurance business. And so they will take your logo and put it on a deck of cards and say, pick a card, and you choose the wrong card. And then something bad happens to the person. And it's like, oh, well, we didn't choose the right card, so things didn't work out because it has this other competitor's logo on it. And so let's try this again. Boom, now you have the right card. Oh, you turn it over. Now it's the client's insurance logo, and everything works out fine. And so that's a messy analogy because I made it up off the top of my head. But essentially what's happening is you are using a medium that is rooted in making people wonder, tricking people, rooted in deception. There's all these natural things that could be these natural insights that could be pulled out of that medium because of what that medium is already communicating, because I believe the medium is the message, as opposed to going, well, regardless of what message this medium communicates, I'm going to force it to communicate this other thing instead. And then it just ends up feeling it's just not an effective way to tell stories. Does that make sense at all?
Okay, let me see if I can reflect it back at you. You can tell me whether I understand. So what I'm hearing is that when you say the medium is the message, you're saying that an intrinsic part of using story effectively is making sure that you're tying together the story that you're writing and inviting people into the medium in which it's being conveyed, as opposed to ignoring the kind of intrinsic associations with that medium in order to kind of force a square peg into a round hole and communicate something that is totally different.
Yeah, that's basically correct. Yeah. I mean, it's all about the context, right? Like if I take a story, when I tell that story in print, but then I turn around and tell that story on television, just by changing the medium, we have to understand that the way the story is being experienced changes. And so we don't take the time to contextualize how we communicate. We just think that every medium is the same, and not every medium is the same. And so that is incredibly relevant to conversations around how do we tell the story via email compared to on a landing page compared to on a stage.
Okay. Can I kind of foray into an example here and see if I'm kind of getting it in context?
Sure.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is that, like, for example, a podcast, which obviously we're engaged in recording right now, is the medium that we're working in, is naturally conversational and naturally, allows a little bit more kind of vulnerability and back and forth, whether it's an interview or, a couple of people kind of like sharing some perspectives and experiences. Versus if we then go and take this transcript, if we wanted to turn it into a blog post, we would not simply just, publish the transcript. We would look at it and we would say, okay, what is the context that people are absorbing blogs in, right? They're usually not doing something else and settling in for half an hour. They're maybe just like skimming the headlines or absorbing it or seeing if the title is relevant to them. We would make sure we were kind of say like pulling out the key benefits, and I don't want to get too nerdy on the copy part, but like, massaging it into that format, as opposed to if you are, writing an authority article, which is, essentially a guest post for another medium, you then would have the context of that person's or that publication's audience and their problems to kind of look at and adopt to that lens. If you were to just kind of copy for all those mediums, it just wouldn't work. It would be dissonant. Is that what I'm hearing?
That is correct. Yeah. And for anyone who's interested in this, that phrase was sort of coined by, I always butcher his last name. It's Marshall. It's like McLuhan. I never know how to correctly pronounce it, but it's McLuahn or HAN maybe. But he kind of coined that phrase, the medium and the message. And there's a lot of other people that have written books and tried to expound on it. But I think the example you just gave is really basically the heart of the idea.
Makes sense that I'm, looking at it through the lens of kind of the copy and what we do. But I know that, when we start to work on kind of more like ongoing, longer term storytelling projects, that's usually what we're doing is how can we unpack your story in the longer term. That's often something that we have to navigate with clients quite a bit, is understanding those different mediums and how they affect kind of your goals. And, also just quite simply, there's only so much energy and only so much time, and you cannot tell your story in literally every medium.
That is correct.
Okay, so this is kind of, blowing my mind. I'd love to keep nerding out on it. Definitely will be researching it. We'll probably link to some of this stuff in the show notes so you guys don't have to worry about spelling it. But I want to kind of expand our conversation a bit from kind of this one-to-one, illusionist telling a story, etc. And acknowledge that when we first connected, it was my friend Ben Stewart from Louder Agency was prepping for the Story Conference back in September. And in fact, he first talked about it probably 2 conferences ago, maybe one or 2 conferences ago. So I'm curious, you've talked about being on stage and creating this connection. What is the Story Conference? Is it just, how did it come about? Who is it for? How is it different from what we've been talking about? Oh, that's a lot of questions. Maybe.
Yeah. We like to think of Story as a community of storytellers who may not always identify with the word artist. They may not all feel like they're creative. We feel like every human being is creative.
Yes.
But they all work in some form of communications or artistic medium where they identify and understand the power that storytellers have. And so it's a community of, thousands of people around the world, about 1,500 of which of them gather once a year in Nashville, Tennessee, is where we gathered this past year to have conversations around that idea, the power that storytellers have. And so we have conversations around everything from collaboration, communication, the creative process. How do we tell stories that shift narratives around the world and change the stories that people tell themselves? And it's been pretty powerful. We're 4 years in. We've experienced a ton of growth and momentum, and the room continues to become more affluent. We're blown away by the kind of companies that attend. Everyone from Apple and Google to Disney and Cirque du Soleil now have presence at Story, and it's been a pretty crazy ride. Yeah.
Wow, that's really impressive, and congratulations. That's in 4 years. That's kind of a big deal.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, and I would go so far as to say it's a big deal, not just because of kind of the growth and the big names and what you've achieved, but the fact that you've managed to bring people together on this concept. So far in this interview, we've talked about story and the kind of ability to manipulate or shift context in story in order to like paint a certain picture. But one of the things that really struck me and has struck me about the Story Conference and about kind of the messaging and everything that comes out of it is the importance of authenticity in story and true empathy and authenticity and bringing that in. So it's not just, we're manipulating stories to change things, but what I really see is this desire, as you said, to nurture wonder in the world and create true human connections. So I'm curious, what sorts of things have you done to kind of maintain or nurture that idea as you've continued to grow and as you've brought in these big names and those things have continued to evolve?
Yeah, I don't know if I know the answer to that question, but I'll take a stab at it. I think at the end of the day, people want to be a part of creating a new and better world. And maybe the best way to understand this is to tell you a story of how I kind of arrived at this conclusion, where the inspiration came from. I remember being probably in my early 20s. I had, to make a very long story short, I had made $1 million doing magic shows around the world. I'm at 21, and by 22, I was bankrupt. And that's a very long story. But what that led to was basically me asking some questions about, how did this happen? How did I end up in this situation where I had this at 21 and had that at 22? And I started to notice the strong correlation between how magic tricks work and how all lies and deception work. And that's all I knew at the time, is that somehow I had been tricked into believing some things that weren't true, and that those lies drove some bad, stupid choices that led to me being bankrupt. And I didn't have the answers to any of my problems. I just was able to identify the root cause of the problem. And I was standing in a gymnasium at a school in Michigan doing a magic show. The principal had brought me to come in and do a school assembly, and I was supposed to say something about, how students need to make positive choices, stop doing things like bullying each other. And I was talking to the principal before, and he goes, you're a magician. You know how to trick people. Go tell these kids how they're getting tricked into making the choices they're making. And the combination of him saying that with the season of life that I found myself in, I wasn't sure what to say, but there was a lot of things going on in my head. And I don't remember everything I said that day, but I finished that short show by doing a straitjacket escape. I had a couple kids come up, put me in a straitjacket. I tried to escape from it. And at the end, I succeeded. And I held the straitjacket up and said, hey, I don't know what lies you've been tricked into believing. I don't know what you feel trapped and entangled by, and what kind of deception is basically holding you back. I don't know what ways you're lying to and deceiving yourself, but I want you to know there's always hope. And I don't know what your straitjacket is, but I've had a lot of straitjackets in my lifetime, and there's always hope. And so don't give up. And it was a very poor attempt at, an attempt to motivate these students to believe in themselves. But I remember this high school girl coming down the steps of the bleachers, beelining it directly toward me. She's bawling. And I'm like, oh no, what's about to happen? She walks up to me and she says, hey, I have something for you. I was like, what is it? She goes, hold out your hands. And she drops a razor blade into my hand and says, that's my straitjacket, and I don't want it anymore. And you're the first person to ever tell me that I matter. And then she had to go back to class. I remember this person coming around the corner going, hey, time to go back to class. And she wiped tears from her eyes, turned and walked away. I saw scars up and down her arms as she walked away. And I'm just still standing there with my jaw dropped, holding this razor blade. I never even got this girl's name. And I became obsessed, literally obsessed with going, okay, not only did I end up in this place of going bankrupt in a year, but like I'm not like physically injuring myself, and like I can't believe that she's doing this. And then I research this and find out there's millions of people harming themselves in this way and so many other ways. And this doesn't even take suicide into account. I became obsessed with trying to understand why. Why would someone make these types of choices? Why did I make these types of bad choices? And that led me back to understanding the power that storytellers have, that essentially storytellers are like the architects of culture, that the stories we tell become the building blocks of people's lives and our world. And I, through my understanding of studying story, came to realize that the reason she was cutting herself is because she didn't feel beautiful, that she didn't feel like her life had value. That was because of bullies at school. If you kind of reverse engineer it all came back to a multi-billion-dollar advertising industry that was trying to sell her a certain car, the right size clothes by photoshopping the right models on the cover of magazines so that she would wear her makeup a certain way. And so storytellers understood, wow, if I tell someone you should wear this brand of clothing, is not as effective as if I communicate with that, shaping that young girl's identity to where she feels like she's nothing without this particular brand. And That's a long way of answering your question, but what it brings us back to is I feel like the person that was in that boardroom at that creative agency that wrote that advertising campaign, that they're probably not a bad human being. That was maybe a mom or a dad who may have even had kids at home that were that girl's age who gave me that razor blade in Michigan. So I don't know that they were trying to destroy the lives of young people. I just don't think they understood or knew how powerful they were. And so our mantra at Story is, how do we serve you well by leaving you with more creative ideas, more innovative thoughts, better storytellers? But while we serve you in exchange for whatever price you paid for your ticket, we're also hoping to call you to responsibility and to action and remind you of how powerful you are and let you know that with that power comes great responsibility. And hopefully from that comes this sort of call to arms, this, inspiring idea that we can do better. And I think they want to do better already. So I think that's the answer to your question is they already want to do better. They just don't know how. And sometimes I think we don't realize how powerful we are.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. What a story. What a story to share. I'm glad that you took the time to share. Thank you. You honestly have brought me to tears. And I agree with you, where you started and where you ended, which is that intrinsically people want to make a difference. They want to make an impact. They don't know how. And the other thing that really jumped out at me from your story being that the people who are using story in this way or have used story in this way, in a way that ultimately has caused harm and disconnection, it's not that they are bad people or evil or the enemy. It's that perhaps they have not had their own experience recontextualized. Perhaps they do not themselves either realize the power of what they're doing or realize the full scope of its impact. And what I'm hearing, this is not quite what you said, but this is what I'm hearing, is that comes from a level of disconnection with their own power, a level of disconnection from the other people that they are impacting, and, perhaps some sympathy or connection there, but perhaps a lack of empathy. And what I'm hearing is that in your work, whether it's on stage or through the Story Conference, and again, not something you specifically said, but what I'm kind of hearing is that the Story Conference is a way to do this in a much bigger, more impactful way where other people can go on and take action and impact other people and create this ripple effect. It really is about creating that empowerment and that connection, and also a sense of engendering a sense of empowered responsibility in that, not shaming people into, you need to do this certain way, but showing them their own power and their ability to create positive change.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to stand on stage and say, shame on you in the room who have created this type of culture of advertising where we're destroying the lives of young people by creating insecurities so that they feel the need to buy stuff. But that's not productive.
It's not
Shame
productive,
is not
I know.
No, it's not a positive motivator. Do I wish that we would stop photoshopping the models on the covers of the magazines that my 4-year-old daughter sees in line at the grocery store? Of course I do. I just know that that's not the path forward. It's to inspire them to a place of empathy and understanding. And look, the people who live out of broken narratives break things in the world. People who tell themselves untrue stories end up telling stories that aren't true. So it just comes back to the narrative that they're living out of, because whatever narrative they've adopted, whether it's true or not, that's what's driving all of their choices, their work, their human behavior. That's what it all comes back to. And so I don't think anyone registered. Maybe some do. I don't think the majority of companies that come to Story, they don't register going, let's go to Story because we're going to become better human beings. They're coming because they want to improve themselves. It's professional development, right?
Yeah.
And so we try to conduct the conference and curate the experience in a way that they get enough value out of the professional development they came for, but they also leave feeling like they're a better human being and a more empathetic person, and that they do understand that they have the power to change the world.
Yeah. That if that ain't magic, I don't know what is, But I do want to take a moment just to kind of speak directly to our listeners here and say that if you yourself are stuck in a narrative in your head that isn't serving you, or if something in your life isn't serving you and you suspect it could be due to kind of narrative or story, don't forget that you can change that. you can change that. It might take help. It might take going to an event like Story or engaging with, some of its resources or people.
Mhm.
It might take something else. It might take therapy. It has taken therapy for me and for a lot of other people.
Yeah,
And that's
same.
okay. No shame in that.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a lot of therapists now that are studying the power of narrative therapy to, now that neuroscience is helping us understand how our brains are wired, to really understand what role you are casting yourself in the story that you're living. And that's showing insane just metrics and stats in the
Yeah.
counseling space, just by a therapist taking the approach of, instead of me telling you the story isn't true or leading you to a place of understanding that might not be true, let's look at this through the context of the story you're telling yourself and what role you're playing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I have personally worked on a project or two in my community. One person in particular who has been taking this concept, and it's funny because he's not connected to neuroscience or to anything, but I was just talking to him on kind of a casual basis and seeing what an impact he's been able to make in our community simply by doing this in a casual way, taking people out for even sometimes just an hour or two walk and hearing their story and hearing their context, and then talking about, what a different context might be. Again, not kind of shaming or putting them down, but inviting them into a new story or helping them create or build a new story. And that's kind of the hyper local level, all the way up to, obviously, I haven't been wanting to get too deep into this, but, what we do at Anansi, that's literally what we do. Every single project we do is based on an understanding of what the person whose problem we are trying to solve is experiencing and what story they are experiencing and what story we can invite them into.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that when I first started out in the web world, niching is a really big thing. And one of the reasons that I decided to operate Anansi in the way that we do is because I just wanted to hear and understand and absorb as many stories as possible. If any of our listeners have listened to other episodes, they will definitely have heard that we work with international organizations that help children, or we work with people who do construction on a local level. And quite often there is an incredible story there about the impact that they're making on the lives of a group, even if it doesn't sound so glorious, as some of the, very important work that's going on in the world. But everybody has a story. That's something we hear all the time. But your story is the key to your impact is kind of what I'm hearing here. And that's really powerful.
Yeah, for sure. I think most people, there can't be empathy without a sharing of your story, and that requires vulnerability. And most of us are not vulnerable because we feel like we need to build trust. So it's like, oh, well, I'll be more vulnerable once I trust this person or this group or this audience. And I think that's a myth. I think that trust is actually built through a practice of vulnerability. So we have to get to a point as a society where we stop with the managing of perceptions. So someone used to call marketing a battle of perceptions, and now we're all in the marketing game because we live in a social media driven culture, which means we're constantly comparing ourselves to other people. We're constantly putting on a show, and we get to control the narrative, and it's not always true because we create these little highlight reels, right? And so unfortunately we're at a place where vulnerability is not really a part of our society. It's not a part of our culture, and we have to get to that point, because until we have a willingness to be vulnerable and embrace and support other people who are being vulnerable, it's only then that we are able to exchange stories. And once we are able to exchange stories, then we can have that exchange of empathy that you're talking about. So we've got a long way to go, but it feels like we're making progress. And so I have hope.
Yeah, that's how I feel too. Long way to go, but we're making progress. And I personally have a lot of hope. And I have to say, doing this podcast helps reinforce my hope with all the cool people I get to talk to.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I want to tune into something that I read on I'm not sure if it was your personal website or the story website, but it really stuck with me, which is that if you rediscovered wonder, your whole life would change. And, one of the things you just talked about is kind of that need to connect before you're ready to feel vulnerable, because that is the path to connection, and safety is not actually waiting for that perfect moment because it doesn't exist. When I hear the word wonder, the first thing that came to me is that wonder is kind of the upgrade on curiosity. And curiosity for me has kind of been that key a lot of the time to connecting with other people and hearing their stories in a way that I can absorb. Is just nurturing a sense of curiosity in myself. But curiosity is one thing. Wonder is incredible, right? That's that magic, that thing that keeps you going every day. I'm curious, what are some tips or observations that you have for people who are looking to regain their sense of wonder?
Yeah, there's a lot there. So first of all, I would say curiosity is wonder in action. That's what my friend Amber Ray once said to me on a podcast interview, which I loved. So I think wonder is probably a state that you are in once you awaken your sense of wonder. The idea to turn that newfound awareness or state that you find yourself in into action would be it. When your wonder is awake, it makes you a more curious person. And so it's impossible to be a person of curiosity unless your sense of childlike wonder is awake. So then it comes down to, well, how do I awaken my sense of wonder? My friend Brad Montague, who created Kid President on YouTube and a whole bunch of other really awesome stuff that everyone should know about, he said wonder surprises us and rescues us from the ordinary. And so I think there's a couple things that you can do to sort of foster a scenario. I don't think you can manufacture wonder. I think wonder does often surprise us and then rescues us from the ordinary.
That's maybe where its power is, even,
Yeah, exactly.
is the fact that you can't manufacture it.
Exactly. So because you can't manufacture it, that means a couple of things. One, you have to be open to it. I don't think that you can fake it and go, what do I need to do today so that I can experience wonder? But you can certainly shift your mindset and be open to the possibility so that when wonder comes in and surprises you and rescues you from the ordinary, you are open to it and you have a willingness to experience and take in all that it has to offer you. And that sounds simple, but that's not something that a lot of us live with. And that is because...
Yeah, that was my next question. I was like, whoa, okay. How do I get there?
And that's because the second thing, and that is that most of us are wonder crushers ourselves, but everything in the entire world is conspiring against wonder. I'm writing a book right now called The Wonder Switch. I don't know if the publisher will stick with that title or if I will stick with that title or not, but it is essentially this idea that wonder it's like a light switch on the wall. And when that light switch is turned on, it changes everything about your ability to see that room differently. So wonder changes how you see, but everything in the world is conspiring against wonder in an attempt to crush it. Because think about it, if your wonder is dead, you don't ask questions, you don't innovate, you settle for the status quo, you get in line, you don't cause a ruckus, and the world gets to continue functioning without disruption. And so everything about the world around us feels threatened by wonder because wonder is so disruptive, which means everything is constantly trying to keep that light switch turned off. And so we have to fight to turn it on. And most of us are born with that wonder switch turned on. We come into this world with our wonder and childlike curiosity wide awake, right? We see possibility everywhere. We believe in magic. And somewhere along the way, something crushes our wonder. It turns off the switch. It could be a coach, a teacher, a parent, a bully on the playground. Something happens. You experience that moment. It crushes your wonder. And for some people, they go their entire lives without ever turning the switch back on. They spend their entire lives in the dark. They are literally asleep and never get to experience that moment of awakening. And those are the people, you probably know some of these people, they're incredibly apathetic, they're really cynical. No matter how much possibility you see, you can't get them to come on board and see any of the same possibility. Roald Dahl famously said that those who don't believe in magic will never find it. So these are the types of people with the wonder switch turned on your entire life. You experience these moments of magic, and then you share those things with these people, and you're like, it's right there in front of your face. How can you not see it? That's because in their mind, they're thinking, I'll believe it when I see it. But they literally can't see it because they don't believe in it. And that goes back to what I said earlier, seeing is not believing, but believing is seeing. So just that belief in the possibility of magic makes you more open to it. But then we have to figure out, what is it that's crushing our wonder? So you can be proactive in the sense of being open to wonder. But even if you were open to those moments where those switches get turned on, you're like, I see everything now. I see all this possibility that I couldn't see before. Those things are going to happen to you and with you, sometimes completely out of the blue. But we have to also get to the point where we are able to identify what is it that is crushing our wonder. And you were like, well, I don't have any enemies in the world. I don't know who would be out to get me. Trust me, everything in the world is out to crush that wonder, like I said earlier. So how do we turn on that wonder switch? And once we do, what does it change? And I literally view it as this little toggle that changes how we use our imagination. And which is why I think wonder and curiosity and imagination are all intertwined. So imagination is one of the most powerful forces and tools on the planet. And I used to think that imagination was something that was active when we were little kids, and then we grew up and stopped using it. And then I realized in studying creativity and leading the story community, I was like, how do I get you guys to use your imagination? Oh, you're already using your imagination every day, but you're using it to be anxious. You're using it to worry and fear about all the
Mm-hmm.
possible things that could possibly go wrong. Some of you, it's still like you're 6 years old and you're believing there's a monster under your bed that's keeping you from creating. And that monster is in your imagination. And it's really no different than when you were a kid. You're just misusing your imagination. So I started trying to reframe worry as a misuse of imagination. And if that's a misuse of imagination, you're using your imagination, that means it takes the same amount of creative energy to just reallocate everything towards using your imagination to dream and to create and to innovate and to think differently. And so you might think, okay, well, how do I use my imagination in that way? Well, that is determined based on that wonder switch. What determines whether you use your imagination to fear and worry or create and dream, I think is connected to whether your sense of wonder is awake or not. So how do we flip that switch on? So I think it's when we have to figure out what's crushing it. We have to eliminate the things from our world and our life that's crushing our wonder. Once we get rid of the wonder crushers, now how do we be open to the possibility? And that is we have to believe that it exists. We have to believe in magic, because those who don't believe in magic will never find it. And you can go searching for magic, but there are also times that magic will find you. And if you don't believe in it, you won't be able to see it when it comes to find you.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. Powerful, powerful words. I think you've just done a brilliant job of breaking down, some of the things. I'm hearing that it's kind of like sleep, like you can't force yourself to sleep. You can remove the impediments, you can be open to it, and you can observe and nurture the things that give you a much better sleep experience.
Sure, and just for fun, this is sort of off topic, but to bring things full circle, guess what you do while you're sleeping? Your imagination is still active, and you still, while your body is physically asleep, your brain is up all night long telling yourself more stories.
Just actively imagining.
Yeah. You are such a storytelling creature. Your imagination is so active that even while you sleep, you are awake all night long creating more stories. It's amazing.
It's incredible. I mean, oh man, this conversation is just such a pleasure. I mean, I want to respect your time, so I have to start bringing it to an end. But I mean, I'm going to be reflecting. I'm going to be reflecting on a lot of things that you've said here. I'm definitely going to be listening to this episode again. A lot of stuff you've said, and I think this is something you've even referenced earlier. Is we hear these same stories. Maybe this is just something I extrapolated from what you said earlier. Is that we sometimes hear the same stories over and over again, but the different kind of like mouths and more and voices and messages and et cetera change the way we hear it. So, what you've said here today is all stuff that I've heard or I've known, but something about the medium or something about just the way that you framed it here today, I think has been really, really special and meaningful for me. And I think special and meaningful for our listeners as well. So before I let you go, I have a few kind of like quick lightning round questions. Sure. Are you ready? Okay. So what is the number one thing that gets you up in the morning?
Oh, the opportunity to open people's eyes so that they can see the magic that is all around them. The opportunity to potentially flip that wonder switch on so they go, oh, wow, I see the world completely differently now. And therefore I see myself in it differently. Possibilities everywhere.
You just flipped my wonder switch on. I'm like, heck yeah. Like I'm like, you can't see me, but I'm like dancing and kind of like swearing a little bit. Cause I'm so there. Okay. A little bit different approach. What's the number one thing you do to preserve your wellness?
Ooh, that is a great question. I think eliminating the things from my life and world and influence that potentially have the chance to crush my own wonder, right? Because if my impact on the world is directly related to my ability to help awaken the wonder of others, that means that I have to keep my own wonder awake. And so I have to do that work that I was just talking about earlier of making sure that I'm protected and guarded and that there are boundaries in place to keep my wonder from being crushed.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, because when you were talking about flipping that wonder switch, like I am someone who is definitely, that wonder switch is on a lot of the time. And that is something that has been really important for me from a young age to kind of drive my life, because I've always believed that, if you take extreme joy out of the simple things, then you will live a life of extreme joy. But for me, the thing that turns it off for me is definitely wellness stuff. Not setting clear boundaries, not setting aside enough time for me to kind of like rest or do what I need to do to identify and remove those wellness and therefore wonder blockers.
Yeah.
But last question, what is the weirdest habit that you have that contributes or has contributed to your success?
No one's ever asked me that before. I don't know what weird habits I have.
Good.
I don't know. I don't even know what weird habits I have. I feel like I live a pretty normal life. But I'm sure if someone was looking over my shoulder, they would realize what a huge weirdo I am.
They'd be like, oh, that thing.
Yeah. I don't know if I have a good answer to your question. A weird habit. I'm happy to pause and think about it for a moment if you would like.
Okay, yeah, I'd love to. If you have a moment to
weird
spare.
Habit.
Or unexpected might be another word.
I don't know if I would consider it a habit, but I have this weird habit before going on stage of paying attention to the people that are coming into the room. I think a lot of speakers are usually prepping and focused on their presentations. And I'm entirely focused on the audience. I'm usually peeking through the curtains. If it's a show, if I'm giving a talk, I'm usually watching and listening. I'll even go into a restroom and go into a stall just to listen to what kind of conversations people are having before. Because I think my ability to impact and influence the way the people in that room think is directly related to how much I know about them and where they are and what stories they're telling themselves. And so I am usually trying to do everything in my power to get my finger on the pulse of a room. And so my habit, I think what might make it seem a little bit weird is it feels like spying. If it's like I'm a part of the CIA gathering intelligence about the audience so that I can...
Going into the bathroom and setting up wiretaps.
Yeah, where some people might say I'm using that against them. I like to think that I'm using this intelligence that I gather for them for the sake of trying to change the stories they tell themselves.
Yeah. I think that it's all about intention there. At a conference I was at a few weeks ago, one of the speakers was talking about neuroscience and kind of similar things here, but from a much more kind of neuroscience perspective. And somebody asked, like, do you ever have any difficulty determining the ethics of what you do and where the ethical line is? And I was very surprised that he had basically no hesitation. He was like, for me, the ethical line, I might be butchering the quote here, but it is whether I am causing people to act contrary to their intrinsic kind of like desires or goals, and what I'm hearing from you is that what you're trying to help people do is redefine the story in the way that they desire to do to make a positive impact, not shift them away from those kind of goals and perspectives into something different. So just something. Since he said that, I've been kind of reflecting on it in a bunch of
I think that's a worthy topic of consideration for sure. So I don't know if that's weird enough for you, but some other people might find that a little bit strange. Other than that, I am a weird person who lives a somewhat normal work routine and balance. So
I definitely relate to that. Well, from one weirdo to another, thanks again, Harris, for coming on the show. This, like I said, has just truly been a pleasure. I definitely have a story on my... I so wanted to go this year. We couldn't make it work. But this has been a pleasure. If you're open to it in the future, I'd love to potentially have you back for more conversations about this.
Yeah, I would love that. And I'll leave you with a final quote, if that's okay. There's a famous quote from Alice in Wonderland, and I loved my friend Linda Wolverton, who wrote the screenplay for the Alice in Wonderland film that Tim Burton directed. She wrote this, and I love the way she wrote it in the movie. Basically, Alice comes back from Wonderland, and her dad walks into the room and says, he could tell she had the dream. She's like, "You had the dream again, didn't you?" And she goes, "Yeah." And then she says, "Have I gone mad?" And I think that's what we wonder sometimes when people like me say, "Yeah, I'm a total weirdo," and then you say, from one weirdo to the other. And so what I would love to leave you with is her dad's response. He says, "Yes." He leans forward, he smiles, and he says, "Yeah, basically you have gone mad. You're off your head, but I'll tell you a secret." He says, "You're entirely bonkers, but I'll tell you a secret. All the best people are." And so, yes, you're weird. Yes, I'm weird. Everyone who listens to this is weird. It's just because they're unique. And we all feel like at times that we're entirely bonkers. And that's because it's true. And the really good news is all the best people are. And sometimes our willingness to embrace our weirdness is directly related to whether our wonder is awake or not. And so to awaken our wonder, sometimes we got to take a trip to Wonderland and spend as much time there as possible.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing. I am finishing up this conversation with a huge, huge smile on my face. Hopefully, listeners, you guys are too. I will talk to you guys next week. And that does it for another amazing episode of the Say It Online podcast. Join us next week. And don't forget to like and subscribe, whether it's iTunes, whatever your favorite podcast player is. It is always, always appreciated. It really makes a difference for us. It helps us get this word out to more people. As always, this episode was brought to you by our sponsor and Say's own business, Anansi Content. If you're a digital agency owner and you're still wasting too much time chasing down content that maybe isn't even all that great, let's talk. We've spent years working on the best process for selling, planning, and delivering amazing conversion content for your client projects. Better yet, we moosh our process to yours so that your client and you have a seamless and amazing experience the entire time through. If you're interested, just go to our website. That's www.anansicontent.com. That's ANANSI content.com. And just click Let's Talk. I'd love to chat with you. Someone else on the team would also love to chat with you too. Hope you have an amazing rest of your day.